Perfect. Just because I'm speaking from my homeland of Australia, as is the custom in my homeland, we usually begin with a welcome to country. And as part of that, I would like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and future of the Eora Nation and the Beja clan. And now I'll begin with my presentation, East of Nubia, results of the Atbai Survey Project. As Mariusz said, this project is dedicated to studying the history of the Atbai Desert of Eastern Sudan. The Atbai is this word that is not very common in the scholarship. I like to use it in respect to the word Eastern Desert, just because it is a word that really emphasizes the indigenous history of the desert. Eastern Desert can be east of Cairo, or it can be east of Kassala, or anywhere between, whereas the Atbai is really the desert as a homeland from the perspective of the Beja people. And as part of my project, I'm really trying to study the archaeology of the indigenous habitants. Of course, we have lots of material culture from Egypt, from Nubia, from the Arab Caliphate, from the Roman Empire in this desert, but I'm really trying to piece together the indigenous history of this desert. So where are we? This is the Atbai. It's not a typical desert in respect to other Saharan deserts like the Western Desert of Egypt or Sudan in particular, because it has lots of high rocky hills and because it gets some amount of summer rainfall, it is relatively fertile. And for that reason, nomadism has been possible there for millennia, and agropastoralism is still even possible in some of the more fertile valleys today. The other big overlay of the history of the Atbai is the fact that it is surrounded on all sides by large urban empires. So Egypt, of course, Nubia, and even to the south in Aksum, and then on the other side wedged in by the Red Sea. So the people of the Atbai have always had complex relations with various states and urban groups surrounding them, and this has sort of changed their history irrecoverably compared to other nomadic groups, perhaps in Northeast Africa, who are surrounded on other sides by nomads. The Beja, Blemmyes, Beja, whoever we call them in various phases of history, are always been dominated or tried to dominate their urban neighbors, and we'll see that in this presentation. When it comes to our projects, the Atbai Survey Project, we have focused on two areas over 2 seasons in 2018 and 2019. Some of you, I'm willing to bet, have probably seen me present on some of these areas before. In the red, we have our survey areas and survey concessions. We have a concession in the Wadi Amur area, just the Wadi Amur, not the area of Nubt, and also a survey concession west of Jebel Rafit. Jebel Rafit is this big mountain massif in this inset here, and we have a excavation concession within Jebel Rafit. And the point of our work is to do things both extensively and intensively. Some sites and some regions need extensive surveying, some sites and some regions we can get very different data through excavations and intensive surveys. And we wanted to study very different ecologies and environments in the Atbai. This eastern side of the Atbai is very fertile, the main range of the Red Sea Hills. Mountains get up to 2,000 meters. The western part of the Atbai, closer to the Nile, is exceedingly barren. And so we get a very different archaeological profile there. Basically, we get a lot more Neolithic remains outside the Red Sea Hills in this flat desert. This is, of course, due to the African human period, and this would have been savanna back then. And in the Red Sea Hills itself, because we have very fertile conditions and a lot of alluvium, it's much more difficult to detect a Neolithic, but we get lots of late antique or medieval remains. Various urban empires around the Blemmyes and Beja and Beja called these peoples very different names depending on periods, depending on scribal traditions and things like this. The most well-known name, of course, is Blemmyes, which starts in about 1000 BC in an ancient Egyptian document. Before that, we usually call the people of the Eastern Desert the Medjai from Egyptian records. There's also other terms like the Hessian Untiu. In classical documents, we have the Blemmyes, we have the Troglodyte, which is much more common in the Ptolemaic period, and then Blemmyes much more common in the Roman period. We also have the fish eaters, the Ichthyophagoi and Megabaroi. And in Ethiopic documents, we have the Beja, which is obviously related to the word Beja, which is the common Arabic term, and the term most frequently used for Eastern Desert peoples today. And this is the speakers of the Beja language, which is a specific language, the northernmost member of the Cushitic languages in Northeast Africa. When it comes to the chronological profile of this desert, just using our own surveys and not other data, we can construct a really long chronology of desert occupations. When it comes to material assemblages, we have lithics going back to the Paleolithic, lots of Mesolithic and Neolithic ceramics. We have a sort of gap in what I would call the early Nubian period, although I know Maria Gatto can sort of fill that gap with her own material. We don't have much material of what I call the Middle Nubian period here. We do have some ceramics and some putative cemeteries that belong to this period. We have a lot of material from late antiquity, what I'm calling the Blemmyes and Beja period, and this goes on well into the Arab period. We do have a sort of linear type of tomb development or burial development over this time. It's usually always dry stone, circular architecture, but it changes quite distinctly over time, so much so that we can describe all these phases with some level of detail. The Middle Nubian phase is not very well known. The Blemmyes and Beja phase leading into the Arab period is quite well known. And then we also have the different livestock. This is so important in Northeast Africa, all over Northeast Africa outside the Nile, and particularly in deserts, the livestock that the peoples in this desert keep and how this affects the archaeological record and also affects their transhumance. So oat, caprids, goat, sheep, etc. are well known since the Neolithic, this whole Neolithic period. We have cattle from the Neolithic going down, but then when we have the end of the African humid period, we seem to have not much cattle after the Middle Nubian period, or probably even during the Middle Nubian period. I have a dotted line here because there are some sites in late antiquity which still show cattle remains going down into the medieval period, so beyond late antiquity, but it's really only in sites and small ecologies which have a lot of fertility. I wouldn't say cattle pastoralism survived over the whole desert into this period. And of course, the most momentous thing to happen to the Eastern Desert, and I think something that impacted its archaeology forever, is the introduction of the camel. This is a big problem on when the camel started to be domesticated in the desert, and this is sort of a separate problem from when camels first went into the desert as traders. What we're interested in is when the camels were actually bred by indigenous pastoralists in this desert, and that seems to be in the early Roman period, or perhaps late Ptolemaic period or something like this, but we don't really have early dates in this area of Eastern Sudan. At least by the early Roman period, we have the first signs of camel pastoralism in the desert. And all this material, as I said, is just based on our own surveys. We could fill in these gaps if we included all the material across the Atbai. The Atbai ecology differs greatly depending on where we are, especially when we get to Red Sea Hills. It's quite fertile. We have almost forests of acacia and tamarisk and things like this, even some dom palms in some places. And when we get down to the southern parts of the Atbai, where the Italian missions are excavating near Kassala, we even get seasonal rivers. The Gash River, of course, floods in summer. The Khor Abat, which is now dammed as Port Sudan's water supply, also floods in summer. And we get such fertile ecologies that we get sort of typical African game in the Red Sea Hills, things like baboon. Once upon a time, we would have had cheetah and giraffe and elephants and things like this, obviously not anymore. And we get very steep ravines where water pools after summer rains and sort of remains there throughout the year. When it comes to our survey, this was conducted in 2018 and 2019 and was under the auspices of Oxford and Yale universities. The point of the first season of the survey was to do much more of an extensive approach to the Atbai Desert and to identify sites that we thought were worthy of further investigation. It was also to identify sites which we thought were at risk of gold mining. And I'm sure most people in this room that work in Northeast Africa, in particular Sudan, are aware of the gold mining boom that is going on in Sudan and how this has a deleterious effect on the archaeology of the region. So we, particularly using satellite photography, wanted to identify and record something of those sites which were near gold mines so that we had some record of these. It's been very difficult to be able to assess this over time and assess what sites are in need of investigation with the ongoing gold mining. But basically, gold mining is going on across the entire Atbai Desert from the Egyptian border to the Eritrean border. So it is really necessary that we do this kind of work quickly. And this changes our approach from site to site. If we think a site might be damaged soon, we have more of an intensive approach. And if some sites we don't seem to be under threat, we have a more extensive approach. Our mission is certainly not the first mission to investigate the Atbai, and on this slide I'll just put some of the missions well known that have investigated this desert. And after these missions, I think we are now at the stage in our knowledge where we can build this sort of linear chronology of the desert in terms of ceramics, in terms of burial assemblages, in terms of lithics and things like this. One of the first European or foreign scholars to study this desert was Lenon de Belfort, and he made really nice drawings and maps of very important sites like Diribab, which is one of the most well-known sites in the Eastern Desert, a gold mining center of the Arab period and possibly also Roman and Ptolemaic period. We have the extensive surveys of Alfredo and Angelo Castiglione and Karim Sadar, who were the first to excavate many sites in the Eastern Desert, including burials. We have the Bergen University mission, which has had a large number of affiliations with Sudanese colleagues and other universities in Europe. And this is studying not only the archaeology of the desert, but the ecology, geography, vegetation, landscape formation, and lots of different things. And this has been a fantastic project to understand the wide environment of the Atbai Desert. We have the gold mine surveys of Dietrich and Rosemary Clem in the 90s. We have the Nureyev project, which I'm sure many people in this particular audience are familiar with, which studied this amazing rock art site of Bir Nureyev, which is this very distinctive mountain. And we also have the Sudan Archaeological Research Society project, not so long ago in 2014, I think, which was studying the epigraphy on the Korosko Road in the western part of the desert. So after all these missions are combined, it is actually possible to build up a good degree of knowledge on a desert that was not very well known, as you can see, before the 90s. Before the 90s, it wasn't very obvious who the indigenous peoples were, the indigenous archaeology was not very clear, and now we're getting a bigger picture. The problem is that the Atbai Desert is truly huge. When I'm in Australia, I always say it's roughly the size of Tasmania, which I think might be actually roughly the size of Poland as well. So something like this, it's a very large desert. There's many sites in this desert, and there's many smaller sub-ecologies that are worthy of investigation, many different occupations. And so it is a huge space in the terms of archaeology in Northeast Africa. And so what these missions have done, including my own, is just a small drop in the ocean compared to what has been done on the Sudanese Nile, for example. So we're really still in early days despite these missions. There are quite a number of newer missions that are undertaking research in the Atbai. There is a Russian Academy of Sciences mission at Diribab, this site up here. There's also a new mission from East Anglia on the coast near the Eritrean border, and there's a new mission of Khartoum University at several sites in the Red Sea Hills under Ahmed Hussein. So there's quite a number of new projects that I think will really change the face of the archaeology of the Atbai. So the aims of our project are to model the indigenous habitation and foreign exploitation, and I'm particularly interested in how these things interacted. This is obviously the case because we have ancient gold mines in this desert. So we have a lot of foreigners coming into this desert, bringing their own wares and archaeology, and how they interacted with the indigenous peoples, and I'll show you a bit of that from the sites that we've investigated, how these two peoples are interacting in this desert, and how this might actually inform us in modern times about something I call resource-based conflicts. This is something that the United Nations, for example, studies ad nauseum, which is how peoples sometimes go to conflict when over resource exploitation and resource access. And this is something we see in the history of the Atbai all the way from the Pharaonic period till today. So when we think of, say, Tutankhamun's gold mask, we're thinking of gold extracted from the Atbai, but accessing the resources of indigenous nomads. Number two is to record and document sites under threat from contemporary gold mining. So sometimes we investigate sites only on the edge of gold mining spaces so they won't be destroyed. And we're also trying to conduct localized excavations at some of these threatened sites and employ a mixture of site-intensive and extensive approaches depending on a whole host of variables, including logistics, which is a big problem in our desert. Again, to show you the rough terrain of where we've gone, east of the, say, 4/5 cataract area, which is quite fertile, and then east of the area around the second cataract and Wadi Halfa, which is completely infertile. So this is really good areas for pastoralists and ecology and vegetation. This area is almost not visited by pastoralists today. This area, you can see from these sort of photographs, contains a fair amount of surface water after summer rains. And this is what makes the archaeology there very different. Most of the expeditions I've just described have studied this area. I think the simple reason for that is that this area is east of the second cataract and south of the first cataract, which was a region well known for pharaonic exploitation. So we have quite a bit of data for ancient Egyptian expeditions in this desert, and that's attracted a lot of missions. And it was also closer to the heart of, say, late Roman Egypt or the Arab Islamic Caliphate in Egypt. So therefore it's attracted a lot of tension around foreign exploitation. This desert around here is much more typified by indigenous nomadic occupations. It does have some well-known sites like Hornupt, for example, but these are not necessarily as well described as the archaeology in the northern Atbai. One of the problems we have in this desert is just a simple one of logistics. There are very few villages in this desert from which we can draw out supplies, so it's very difficult to get petrol, water, food, etc. in the desert, which means we need to outfit our Land Rovers and four-wheel drives with 3 to 4 weeks worth of supplies, which has a big limiting effect on the sort of archaeology we can do. For example, excavating too much is just not possible because we have to put it all back in the cars to take it back to Khartoum or a site magazine. So this really limits how long we can stay at sites, the kind of activities we can do at sites, even the kind of equipment we can bring, and the number of specialists and experts we can bring. Luckily, we have 2 amazing drivers, Osman Dafala, Salah Mohammed Saleh, and Mubarak Adam, who are perfect for this kind of desert driving and have really made the expedition a pleasure compared to what it could be in this difficult terrain. Generally speaking, you get a flat tire about every day, and we're about 1 to 2 days drive from the nearest tarmac road sometimes. So it's a very difficult terrain to work in. There are usually only tiny desert tracks like this we can follow, and this makes and shapes the way we investigate these sites. When it comes to the destruction in the desert, the reason why I put such an emphasis on this is something like this site, which is a unnamed and undiscovered cemetery near Jebeltogney, basically east of Abu Hamid. And this site, based on the satellite photography, looks like something that might be a 2nd millennium BC occupation, something that's been sort of well described from 4th cataract sites in Nubia. And just before we wanted to go there, we have satellite photos that tell us something like this, that the whole site has been bulldozed. It's near a modern gold mine. So this is really why we need to conduct excavation and surveys in this desert with some urgency and speed, because these sites are being destroyed at an alarming rate. You can see, for example, in this particular cemetery, the whole cemetery has been bulldozed. So we will now know nothing of the burial archaeology of this particular site. To go to the narrative of what we've found on our surveys, the first site that we looked for in 2018 was a ancient site called Jebeltogney. This was described in the notes of Sir Douglas Newbold. Newbold was a governor of Eastern Sudan. It was pretty easy to find because on the British Army maps of the early 20th century, they had a big mining icon and ancient village. So it doesn't make it easier than that to find. Newbold's notes note several gold exploitations in the hillsides, ridges of quartz, and they also note this large set of structures, 150 meters long, separated by a long street in the middle. So this is quite large when it comes to gold mine architecture in the desert. On the satellite photography, it was pretty easy to identify. Again, when we got to the site, it was something like this. It had been mainly destroyed. You can see this is the modern gold mining operations, and you can see the rest of this structure here, which by the time we got there had mainly been destroyed. We did take some photographs and were able to walk briefly through the site and see something like this. Interestingly, the modern gold miners had built their settlement on top of the ancient settlement, which is a nice sort of continuity, I guess. So on top of the walls of the ancient miners' settlement. It was probably a gold working settlement full of millstones dating to the 9th, 10th century. This is when this sort of architecture of a large street like this is very common in the early Arab gold mines. It doesn't seem to be a feature of late Roman gold mines. The next site we went to was a site called Alitiatip, which in the Beja language means the place of Ali's goats. There's most of these sites in the Red Sea Hills still have Beja nomads roaming through the site, keeping camels, cattle, goats and sheep and things like this. And this site was near a Beja camp, so there was quite a lot of informants there to tell us interesting things about the site, including problems of gold miners and such. Alitiatip is sort of midway between the 4/5 Cataract reach and the Red Sea coast. And it's also on this really large wadi catchment called the Wadi Amur. The Wadi Amur is one of the biggest water catchments in the Eastern Desert. At the end of one of its branches, the Wadi Agwamt, we have the capital of what is considered to be the capital of the Blemmyes, Nupt, just in this region. And north of Wadi Agwamt, in the northern branch of the Wadi Amur, we have this site, Alitiatip. And this site was really a large site, unexpectedly large, that had been first documented by Dietrich and Rosemary Clem in the upper vales of the Wadi Amur. Just to show you the upper Wadi Amur basin, we have the Nile this way, Red Sea coast, and in the middle of the basin, we have this settlement of Alitiatip. In addition to being on a good route on east-west wadis, it's also on a good north-south route that goes up and down the Red Sea on the western side of the main range. At the settlement itself, you can, if you stand on top of the granite hill, you can see modern farming going on there, which surprised me, but it shouldn't be a surprise to many archaeological missions that have gone in this area, that their agro-pastoralism and some sort of agriculture is possible in this desert, but only possible in the relatively fertile wadis where they form sort of a ravine, and we can make artificial water catchments which stop the water. And this might be the exact reason we have a very large ancient settlement in this wadi. And it's an ancient settlement that is a lot bigger and a lot more nucleated than we usually get in the Atbai Desert. There are large settlements like Diribab and Nubt, but these aren't necessarily a regular feature. They seem to only occur in ravines on the western side of the main range of the Red Sea Hills, where some sort of agro-pastoralism is possible. You can see on this map here, you can see the settlement. This is the circular sort of outline of the settlement here. It's right next to a granite outcrop. And these features here is modern agriculture. And you can see that they've constructed these lateral sand dams across the Wadi Basin to stop the water flow, which would thus create the ability to make a crop after summer rains. This is the settlement itself here. It's about 70 to 80 dry stone hut bases. Some of them are so close together and dense that they made multi-room structures. Generally, they put in structures of 1 to 2 to 3 sort of rooms. None of the walls survived basically 40, 30 centimeters off the ground. So there's a question there as to whether this sort of settlement should be considered something like a seasonal camp, which would have had tent, matting, wood, or some other perishable material on top of the hut bases. There's a few sections to the settlement: the North Cemetery, the main settlement structure here. There's a Quartz Vein and a South Cemetery. The Quartz Vein is important because it suggests that this settlement might not just have one role. Like one of the roles I've already alluded to is the role of an agricultural settlement or an agro-pastoral settlement for something like we might call semi-nomads. But the site could also function as a gold mining node. And I think it's important when we think about the archaeology of urbanism and settlements in general, that settlements always have multiple roles. That's sort of one of the definitions we have of settlements, is that they're not just monofunctional. And so this settlement, I don't think we can just sort of pigeonhole into having one role for pastoralists, one role for agro-pastoralists, or one role for miners. It probably had a series of functions like this. There certainly isn't the sort of archaeology that we usually get at dedicated mining settlements. That's not seems to be what we have here at Alitiatip. There's not many millstones. There's no washing tables and things like this. That's not to say that some gold processing didn't go on, but we don't really have the same sort of archaeology that we get at other mining settlements in the Atbai. But we do have a quartz vein very close to the settlement, and that quartz vein was definitely worked in ancient times. This is our mapping of the settlement. Most of the huts occur in this middle section. There is a large sort of platform structure here, and there are two structures on top of the granite tor, which are probably acted as outposts or watch posts or something like this, maybe to look over the agricultural fields. Most of the huts look something like this. They're slightly raised above ground, all sort of loose dry stone local blocks arranged in rectilinear features, which is quite different to other nomadic settlements that we get maybe further north in the Eastern Desert of Egypt, where we have a mixture of rectilinear and curved walls. At this site, it is just rectilinear walls and square walls and things like this, which leads one to some problems on how to reconstruct these sort of tent dwelling or mat dwelling or something like this that might be constructed on top of these dwellings. It is one of my goals to go back to this settlement and conduct some excavations within these domestic architecture to understand more of the settlement. This is the platform structure just below the granite area. We have two sort of huts on either side and then some stones in between. Similar structures on the Nubian Nile have all sorts of interpretations, from Islamic prayer sites to even church sites, to some sort of communal sites, to also tethering stones for livestock pens and things like this. I don't think we can really conclude one way or the other what this site is until a concerted excavation is underway on this particular structure. It has an identical parallel in the site of Tabot, which is not so far away. So it does seem to be a sort of standard feature of Atbai agro-pastoralist sites. In the publication of Ulrich Luft on Birmene, which is a well-known Blemmyes site in Upper Egypt, they have these amazing images of some Blemmyes or Northeast African nomadic dwellings built on top of stonework and other work. And I think that might be something that we have here in these sort of platforms. It is difficult to reconstruct it with the rectilinear surface. Usually we have, in vernacular architecture of the modern day Beja, we have circular structures. We do have some rectilinear structures even in modern times, where you would have a tent sort of tent pole in the middle, and then you have sort of a rectangle of matting on either side of that. That is one possibility. We really need to conduct more excavations, but it seems like this is the sort of model of tent bases or something like this. And we have this replicated at other sites in the Eastern Desert. When it came to the assemblages at the site, it was very interesting. We found a lot of this particular decorated ceramic with incised decoration called Eastern Desert ware. It's a fairly distinctive ware to find, and of course you expect to find it when you're in the middle of the Eastern Desert. What we didn't expect is to find so many sherds. When Hans Barnard wrote his book about Eastern Desert ware, it was usually always a minority sherd at most sites. So it was found at sites in Upper Egypt, some sites on the Nile and at the harbour of Berenica and so forth. But there were always more Roman sherds and things like this at these sites, or post-Meroitic sherds. But at Alitiatip, it seemed to be one of the main wares of the site. So in our short walking survey, we found hundreds of these sherds on the ground. Most of them have this distinctive decoration, but they are a household wear, handmade wear, so they do vary quite a lot across the Eastern Desert. We have some suggestions that not only this site, but Tabot have hundreds of these sherds compared to other sites. So it may be that these areas are connected to some sort of production site in the middle of the Red Sea Hills. That's one hypothesis I have. This map here, which is building on Hans Barnard and Andrea Manzo's maps of where Eastern Desert ware has been found, you can see that a lot of the sherds cluster at these sites in the middle of the Atbai. They're also well known in Lower Nubia, where we have the Blemmyes living in Kalabsha and Kazaribrim and Philae and places like this. We also have it at these so-called enigmatic sites in the Upper Egyptian Desert, and it's always found as one or two sherds in the Upper Nubian Nile, and we have some sherds all the way down near Aksum, and probably one or two sherds at the port of Afar on the Yemeni Saudi coast on the Arabian Peninsula. So you can see from the center of gravity that the Red Sea Hills is probably connected to where these sherds are made. This ware is made. The surveys of Dietrich and Rosemary Clem at this site found hundreds of these sherds as well and took them back to the British Museum. So it's a good thing that we can able to study some in London as well as the Eastern Desert and get some ideas about their construction and so forth. But I think we do have some interesting phenomenon relating to this where that is central to the Red Sea Hills. At Alitiatip, I said that its original definition was something like a mining site because we have this huge quartz vein and just fields of quartz pebbles around the site. And of course, quartz is connected to the mineralization of gold. So we figured it must be a mining site. And that is a distinct possibility. We do have millstones, but these sort of millstones aren't the typical millstones that you usually see at late antique gold mining sites. Usually you see much larger millstones and these so-called rota millstones, which is found at many sort of early Arab and late Roman gold mining sites. And we don't have this at Alitiatip. So we might have to have some sort of solution where this site was involved in some sort of putative mining, or perhaps gold, processed gold from other mine sites was channeled to Alitiatip. There's lots of mine sites in the upper Wadi Amur, maybe 50 to 100 kilometers away from this site. So we could see something like this was a center for trading, processing, and refining gold rather than it being the initial place of gold working. There are quite a number of tombs and burials around the site and also around the whole ring of the upper Wadi Amur. There's thousands of late antique burials if we count them all. At one of these burials that we have some the millstones within the burial itself. So it suggests that if the mining was taking place, it was these same people that were using this mining technology, so, or at least using what was a pre-existing mining site. At the southern end of the site, on top of one of these burials, we were lucky to find these distinctive figurines, all terracotta or ceramic, and they all have a sort of vaguely similar shape. Most of them are broken. Some of them look phallic, although other parts of some of them have female organs, and some of them look like they have animals. So we're not really sure that it's all belonging to one sort of figurine. This sort of shape seems to be the predominant one, and they were all strewn across the ground at this particular tumuli here, but not within the tomb, not on top of the tumulus itself, but on every circumference of the tomb. So the general supposition is that these could have been from a robbery and all the material was taken out of the burial of the tomb and strewn across the ground. But we do have votive deposits of these sort of objects in other parts of the Atbai, and I'll show you those in a second. So it could be that these particular figurines aren't necessarily part of the burial assemblage, but they could be a votive deposit. I wouldn't say either way. They all have this sort of at the top, these distinctive holes put in them. They have these nice sort of eyes and mouth and things like this. And they're quite a unique objects that doesn't really have a parallel on the Sudanese Nile in this period. My closest historical explanation to this is a text from the Arab Muslim historian al-Tabari. And in this text, he is talking about a war between the Beja and the Caliphate at the time around 900 CE. And he talks about the invasion of Al-Qumi, who was an Arab general who went into the desert to put down these Blemmyes and Beja raids, which had been occurring in the times of the Caliphate. And then Qumi says, left with Ali Baba, who was the name of the Beja king. It's probably not his real name, just an Arabization of his name. And he says that the Beja king, Ali Baba, had persevered in his own native religion. Some people state that they saw him carrying a small stone idol in the form of a child, to which he prostrated himself sometimes. So when I hear this text, I imagine something like this, that maybe Ali Baba, the Beja king, had some sort of figurine like this that he was still using to worship. By this period, we know that some of the Beja had converted to Islam. We have Arabic inscriptions from the 9th century in this desert. So it's possible that we have this sort of phase between their perseverance of their pagan indigenous religion and the religion of Islam. As I said, these particular style of figurines have been found at other sites, most celebrated of which is Nurayat, which everyone in this audience will be familiar with, of course, this large rock art site further to the north, almost near the Egyptian border. And the figurines at Nurayat, I'm given to understand, were found in this sort of natural / artificial stone box made out of natural stones, but put into the shape of this box. And so these figurines here would seem to be some sort of votive deposit. Because of the density of rock art at Nubia, there's obviously some sort of sacred ritual rites going on in the landscape there. The other site that has been found out is by a site survey by Jacques Renaud at the site of Jebeltogney. And at this site, the figurines were interpreted as being part of a workshop context and actually have a C14 date, also to late antique / early medieval times. So we do have this figurine at several sites across the Eastern Desert. Not so long ago, Steve Sidebotham alerted to me that they have one of these figurines at Berenica, the harbour site as well, near the temple. So we now have these figurines at 4 sites across the Atbai, mapping something like this. I think this distribution, even though it's early days of surveys, is quite important, because if you look at the distribution, we have a lot of these figurines at Alitiatip, and we have a lot of these figurines at Ajami, as you can see on this map, and Nurayat and Berenica. And you can almost link these sites, because when you go north in the Eastern Desert, the most easy north-south route is a route called the Khor Oko, or Wadi Dib, which is one of the few wadis that cuts through the main range of the Red Sea Hills. So for example, if you're wanting to get from the main part of the Red Sea Hills towards Berenica, or the later port of Aydab, the Islamic port, you would have to use the Khor Oko Wadi Dib. Other routes are just too difficult. So it may have been that there was some sort of connection or some sort of nomadism going between, also transhumance going between the central part of the Red Sea Hills and these Roman / Arab Islamic ports on the Red Sea coast that brought these sort of objects to the Red Sea. This site of Alitiatip, as I said, has other parallels in the Red Sea Hills, and it seems that these parallels are a little bit distinct from the sites we have further north in Upper Egypt. We have these so-called enigmatic sites in Upper Egypt, which have lots of similar architecture, even some Eastern Desert wear. What's different about them is the ecological setting. So in Sudan, we see these agro-pastoralist camps only in relatively fertile wadi areas. So we have Khor Omek, which is one near Khor Nubt, the so-called capital of the Blemmyes, not far away from Khor Omek and Alitiatip at Tabot, possibly one at Tekol, although the suggestion is that Tekol might also be a gold mine, but again, we don't necessarily need to separate them, and a sort of agglomeration that looks vaguely similar at Jebel Gurad. So all of these places are in settings where in the Wadi basins, it might be possible to produce some sort of agriculture, or at least they're in wadis where there's some sort of better water sources than there is generally in the Upper Egyptian desert. Using some Sentinel satellite imagery, I was able to get a better understanding of the amount of moisture content and agricultural potential of the Wadi Amur, not just looking at the modern agriculture from the photograph or something like this. And you can see from this slide here, which this is a particular wavelength of light that's measuring moisture content, not only in the soil, but also in vegetation. And you can see that the Wadi Amur is the main path of water falling from the Red Sea Hills in this region. So it's a really ideal landscape for agriculture, in a landscape that is actually really devoid of agricultural potential, at least since the end of the African humid period. Now, if I show you over this video GIF that I think, yeah, that's going well. The site of Alitiatip is just here, and the lateral sand dams built in modern times are here. So I think this actually is one of the reasons for the location of the site, because these sand dams are built in an advantageous place where 2 wadis are meeting each other, and thus making it a very good place for agricultural potential. And you can see here that it's July now, so the summer rains should come in the Red Sea Hills soon. This is the clouds of the summer rains. And then we should see the wadi and these wadi walls filling up with moisture. You can already see it here. It's growing and growing and growing and growing here as the water runoff comes off the Red Sea Hills. And I think this is a good explanation at what's happening at this particular site of Alitiatip. It's a sort of agro-pastoralist settlement. Here's a map of these so-called settlements, or at least the ones I've identified either from surveys or satellite photos. The ones in Upper Egyptian Desert are well known. These seem to be either near trade routes, near harbors, on the side of trade routes, near wells and things like this. There's really, I don't think, any possibility of really settled agriculture at these sites in the Upper Egyptian Desert. At the Nubian East Sudan sites, we have something different. Most of these sites, based on the pottery, date between the 3rd and 9th century, which is also the period when we have Eastern Desert wear, roughly. Moving on with our surveys, a very cool and interesting site, and one that intrigued me and I wanted to go to for a long time, was a site I identified on the satellite called Diribab, which means wedding place. On the east side of Diribab, we had a Neolithic occupation, lots of lithics, lots of ceramics on the ground, some Neolithic and Mesolithic ceramics, one possibly Middle Nubian ceramics, so 2nd millennium BCE. But on the south side, we found something very interesting, which is this cemetery of sort of ring graves of a particular type. It's not late antique, and it's certainly not the Neolithic type either. It's something in between. This is Diribab South, AS 1819 in our site codes. And there are a few sherds here which were sort of indicative of a 2nd millennium BC occupation. The reason why I'm really interested in this is the 2nd millennium BC is sort of missing in this desert. We don't have many ceramics from the 2nd millennium BCE in the Atbai. We don't have any really known cemeteries, so this is why this one is particularly interesting. And we certainly don't have any domestic architecture of anything like that that we can connect to 2nd millennium BC occupations. Of course, we're looking for something like Kerma or Pangrave or C group occupations in this desert, but they're quite difficult to find. You only find the odd sherd here and there. And this is why this cemetery, which has sort of like quite strong parallels to the sort of the typology of tomb types in the 4th cataract, we think might be a contender for a 2nd millennium BC occupation. And we also have the possibility in this period that the desert was slightly wetter than it is today. There's been some ecological studies in the Red Sea Hills that even show surface water up until the 4th century CE. So it's not the narrative of the African humid period causing drying conditions in the Sahara is generally true, but when we look at specific regions, we do have to account for rainfall in high mountains, fertile valleys, and so forth, not really flowing with this specific narrative. Now to move to a very different ecology. This is the deserts of East Nubia, East Lower Nubia, east of Wadi Halfa and the 2nd Cataract. It's completely dry, hyper-arid in this desert. Most of this region receives no rainfall, not even summer rains, 0 millimeters on most sort of modern measurements. You do get the odd bit of rainfall, but unless it falls in a ravine, it doesn't really make the ecology feasible for nomadism in this desert. So it's more a sort of ecology for trade routes, although we do have a very different picture in the Neolithic phase. This region is pretty well known from surveys that have been interested in ancient Egyptian expeditions, including my own, the Egyptian fortresses at places like Buhen and Mirgissa, and also going further north at Alaki and these sort of places. Brought Egyptian expeditions to the gold mines, which are, of course, in this desert. And we know from hieroglyphic inscriptions that Egyptians were going into this desert to mine gold, and these routes are traceable through the archaeological record. Most well known are the expeditions of Alfredo and Angelo Castiglioni, who found many of these hieroglyphic expeditions, and Vivian Davies and Derek Wellesby, who recorded them in subsequent years. Our surveys have been interested in these same terrains. Sometimes we're trying to revisit and record the sites of the Castiglionis, and then sometimes on the same routes we are finding new sites. We're particularly interested in this north-south axis of hills north and south of Jebel Nahoganet, and this east-west section of hills on Nazbenat, which would lead to Buhen and Wadi Halfa. And this series of hills we thought might be an interesting place between a sort of higher desert and lower desert with several passes in between. And Jebel Rafit in the south side is where we conducted excavations in a separate campaign. As I said, in this desert, it's well known for its pharaonic material. We have hieroglyphic inscriptions of Egyptian military officials or gold miners and so forth, iconographic features of ancient Egypt, stone cans or alarm belonging to Egyptian expeditions. And on the same routes, we have some amount of, but not many, of Middle Nubian ceramics. So probably indigenous peoples working with the Egyptian expeditions. This desert, even in this period, is unlikely to be very useful for nomads. There's not much water or grass. There is a sort of earlier phase of possibly Egyptian, but it also could be ascribable to a group transhumance into this desert. This is probably in a period when there's still grassland in this desert in the 4th millennium BC. And in this period, we found lots of these large boat tableaus, which we've published with Dorian van Hoel, and we're able to date them fairly accurately to the late 4th millennium. And these are huge things on top of Inselbergs in the desert. At the site of Jebel Said, we've had these really interesting cave, and at the back of which we had some ochre paintings, which has quite a few parallels, but nothing that makes me certain of when it would date to. At another site, AS 1900, we had this Saharan-style rock art, which is a sort of new discovery in this eastern desert. We do have some painted rock art, but not much, and certainly not of this earlier type, which is much more common in, say, the Fezzan or Tibesti in places like this. Jean-Luc Lequelec tells me that this feature of the head of the cow and the herdsman being rubbed out is a feature also of Saharan rock art, so things that we see west of the Nile. So this was an amazing find outside this cave system. And outside this cave system, we found a really huge debitage of ceramics and lithics and sherds, macroliths, microliths, cores, points, everything. And so that was a quite nice connection. Then some of these rock art sites, because of deflation, we can actually link the rock art possibly with the lithic and ceramic horizon. Of course, we need to do further studies, and it's difficult to date rock art, and we're tentative about these connections. But this is a really good opportunity to be able to link these archaeological horizons outside these caves with this rock art. Unfortunately, this cave at AS 19100 was mainly filled with sand, so it's not sure that what we found of the rock art is a tiny bit of what there is or what there was. Moving on to AS 1926, and this should appear in press pretty soon, I hope. Sorry, in print. We have this strange tunnel-like feature on the side of an Inselberg. It's completely natural, but ancient artists, again in the 4th millennium BCE, probably when transhumance is still possible in this desert, painted this massive boat tableau of meters wide in the tunnel. It's so difficult to record because you can't really stand up in the tunnel, you're on your knees, and you actually have to crawl into the tunnel to see this boat tableau. The fact that they're inscribing boats here leads me to think there is something connected to the Nile, not something connected to necessarily pastoralists, but perhaps pastoralists that use the Nile as well as the desert as part of their transhumance. The Castiglione missions found a number of these as well, so I think we actually have a putative style of 4th millennium BC transhumance and a sort of iconography connected with it that's perhaps traveling between the interior desert and its grasslands where would have been pastoral, so it would have been grazing opportunities, and the lower Nubian Nile in this period. And of course, lots of other materials outside these rock art sites, and many sites which were not connected to rock art at all, with large stone pallets, Neolithic and Mesolithic ceramics, cores, a few Middle Nubian sherds, not many, and some stone cans, and some of these enigmatic boxes. I really don't have any idea how to date them because there's no material with them, and hut bases like this, which are quite common in many horizons in Sudan. I'll now move on to a season where we conducted some site-intensive work in excavation, and this is the site of Jebel Rafit. And this is a large plateau and massif in the middle of the Eastern Desert, and it's really at a strategic point on this trade route. This is a so-called Korosko Road, which cuts off the so-called S-bend of the Nile. And it's also important because not only does it have gold mines, but it also has some of the few water sources in this desert. In pre-modern times, in the Ottoman period, for example, the authorities built wells in this desert, and they were useful. But most of this desert, you can't really construct wells, and the water table was way too deep, unless that were extinguished over time. And we don't really have much evidence of ancient wells. But in Jebel Rafit, because we have these ravines in this mountainous plateau, when there is rainfall, water pools in the ravines and provides some of the few watering opportunities that we have in this desert. And which is probably also explains why we have lots of rock art in this desert. We have things connected to all periods in this desert. Whereas if you go to the deserts west of Jebel Rafit, it's really only Neolithic occupation and pharaonic trade routes. Whereas at Jebel Rafit itself, we have every period represented. We also have one Middle Nubian site, which I like to show because they're so rare. It's a series of dry stone architecture on this tiny ridge outside Jebel Rafit. and we found a few sherds that looked like of a Middle Nubian style at Jebel Rafid near a place called Garifat. But I certainly wouldn't want to say that all this architecture is second millennium BC without doing excavations. The main site we were interested in at Jebel Rafid was a site called Khor Rafid. It's on the south side of Jebel Rafid. On the maps, it's called Medina, which is a bit of a strange name because Medina just means town or city. But we have one sort of oral tale that has been printed in Sudan Notes and Records, which actually suggests that this site was called Medina because it's squeezed between hills, like the famous Medina in Saudi Arabia. So this was the name of the site because it evoked that particular site in Arabia. I prefer to call this site Khor Rafid. It is a really large site, about 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, and it's at the bottom of the plateau itself, where the plateau forms a ravine and this large wadi system coming out of the ravine. Most of the site can be ascribable to the large gold workings in the ravine itself, but we also have a large cemetery, and because of the ravine, we have the possibility of not agriculture, but pastoralism. There's quite a lot of grass within the wadi bed itself, and we have acacia, which is great vegetation for goats and camels. And we also, importantly, have a water source, which I call jamam here, which is a Sudanese Arabic word for a natural reservoir. So we have multiple different occupations over a wide chronology at this site. We have the water source here, gold workings within the ravine, which is like in this picture. We have rock art. We have a large cemetery at the south of the site. And we have 3 areas with settlements. I wouldn't say these settlements are really settlements in any real sense. They're camps or nomadic camps that were possibly connected to the gold mine or the watering opportunities at the site. So to show you from another view of the site, here we have one of the settlements. The settlements are always in these sort of wadi terraces in the middle of these large wadi systems here. This large excavation on the side of the hill is the main focus of gold mining. On this dotted line, we have a large track. This track seems to be in use until maybe like the 1800s, but was also in use in ancient times. It's a large camel track that was probably one of the main parts of the Corusco road that came into Jebel Rafid to find water, because the water source in this particular area is just behind this hill. At the south end of the site, we have a cemetery, and on the distant horizon, we have Bir Murat, which was a well-known watering site on the Corusco road, but more watering for camels because the water's too brackish. Just to take a transect through the wadi of what the space looks like, we have a cemetery over here of mainly late antique tombs. It's occurring only on the wadi terraces. We have a large domestic space or a sort of campsite in the middle here. And then we have a gold mining workshop, which is full of gold millstones. And right above it, right next to it, is a Neolithic rock art site, where you can see some of the panels here, which is quite confusing because the gold mining workshop has nothing to do with Neolithic era. It's all late antique, late Roman, early Arab, whereas a Neolithic rock art is almost bleeding into the gold mining workshop, which provides some quite difficult chronological considerations for the site. Like, was the workshop built on top of earlier workings or earlier sites? This is what the water source at the site looks like. It's what in Sudanese Arabic you call jamam. It has a dom palm and some reeds. There is one tiny bit of rock art right behind the reeds. We have to move the reeds to record it properly. But generally speaking, the wadi basins here are not conducive to finding archaeological material. There is a large structure just on this shelf here, which I'll show you in a little bit. The main reason for occupation of the site was this large gold mine. This is the excavation, artificial excavation of quartz. And in the workshop itself, there are lots of these millstones. Now, these millstones are found everywhere at gold mines, and this is sort of similar to ones that you would find in Roman and Arab periods at many gold mines throughout the Eastern Desert. The workshop area seems to be dilapidated and ruined in a way that doesn't look like its original layout and plan. They're usually a fair bit more ordered than what this looks like. I think what has happened at this site is not only has a fair extensive amount of flash flooding happened, but a lot of reuse of the materials for other structures and the use of a later nomadic camps, possibly as late as the 19th century. So we have quite difficult chronology in this site. We had glazed Arab materials, late Roman amphorae, and also modern materials. And even the Lepsius expedition, for example, talks about a village somewhere near the Jamam. So I think this actually around here might be where there was a pre-modern nomadic camp as well, which explains why the gold mining workshop area is completely ruined and the walls are gone and things like this. This is what it looks like up close. It's just lots of ruinous walls. Most of them are constructed out of millstones now. There's just literally hundreds and hundreds of millstones throughout the site. It was a really intense area of gold working. On the east side of the site, we have these, what are probably washing tables, these structures here. When they were in their original function, they probably had an inclined surface, and you can see how they were used here. This is one of the Castiglione expeditions recording a washing table. And you would have water and a basin of non-refined gold, and you use the water to separate the gold, and it would pour down this incline like this. And you can see a really nice image of this by the gold miner Llewellyn. Llewellyn was one of the early 20th century miners that worked in Eastern Sudan, and he also recorded a lot of the gold mines and the ancient gold mines in the area. This is the space of the northern settlement. You can see these are just tiny hut circles. Again, we can probably think of some sort of matting or perishable material on top. Some of them I wouldn't even call, huts or tents. They're just windbreaks. And this is one in the north side of the site as well. And this is a fairly common vernacular architecture at many places in Sudan to have these sort of windbreaks. They're all orientated to stop the northerly wind, which is really punishing at this site. Even we were uncomfortable and eventually ditched our tents because it would drag tent pegs out of the ground, and it was not comfortable staying in a flapping tent all night. In the quartz tailings itself, we found a few objects. We hope to excavate these in the future, things like baskets and what looks like some sandal strappings at some parts and things like this. Above the gold mine, there was a station of Neolithic rock art, cattle, giraffe, ostrich, things that are quite common, not just in the Eastern Sudanese desert, but on the Sudanese Nile itself as well. As I said, above the Jamam, we have what's possibly the largest structure at the site. This is the only multi-room structure at the site with walls possibly to an original height. The walls are about almost 2 meters high. And it's also well-constructed walls. It doesn't look it in this image, but it has casings on either side with rubble in the middle. So this building is something different compared to most of the buildings in the settlement area. We do have very similar structures at other Arab period gold mines, such as Wadi Amur, which date to the 8th, 9th century. So I'm thinking it's some sort of administrative building connected to the site. It also looks over the water source, so it can very easily control traffic in and out of the gold mine. And gold mining and refining gold is something that needs water as part of processing. So controlling the water source is not only controlling the sort of nomadic transhumance in the area, it's also controlling the gold mine industry. The southern part of the site had a very extensive cemetery, and this is why this site is so interesting. Usually at late Roman and early Arab gold mines in the desert, we don't have the conjunction of gold mining and cemeteries. And when we do have this conjunction, it's usually only one or two or a handful of tombs. At Khor Rafit, we have almost 100. We counted 99 tumuli in the southern cemetery. And so we have 99 structures here, and most of these structures are of the type of tomb that you would associate with the Blemmyes, that is Eastern Desert nomads. And we have this sort of type everywhere throughout the Eastern Desert, even lower Nubia at Kalabsha South and Moala in Upper Egypt. And at most of these sites, it's a fairly typical sort of tomb type with straight sides, circular in plan. When you investigate these tombs, they always look like donuts like this because they've all been robbed, of course. Some of these tombs have tapered sides and tapered types. And this is this sort of structure in the west part of the cemetery. And they're all, the examples have been dated thus far, usually date to late Roman to early Arab. So this is this common period that shows up in the Atbai archaeology, something between the 3rd to 9th century. In places like Kalabsha South, it's even more constricted than that, but that seems to be the dates based on pottery and some carbon dates. This site is also quite close to a modern gold mine, so we have some urgency in investigating and recording this site. Some of the structures have already been bulldozed by gold miners at the site. And to show you this transect again of our kite photography, this is our camp here from where we conducted excavations, and this is the western part of the cemetery. We excavated 2 tombs in this eastern part of the cemetery. I'm just showing you this photo because that's the easiest photo. We excavated tomb number 1, which was a small, very small structure. We wanted to see what it was like to excavate, and it was a very tapered on the side structure. It turned out to be the burial of a child. The general flow and plan of these tumuli is large stones above a burial cutting, quite a lot of rubble and sand and windblown sand is in, and very loose stones on top. That's the basic structure. So it seems to be that the burial was very carefully built on top of the burial, which was cut into the bedrock or the natural ground. And above that, it was much more haphazard. In these structures, we found no materials whatsoever. We didn't find any ceramics, lithics, beads, anything like this. We found textile impression, and we found human remains, but no ceramics. There were ceramics associated with the burials, on top of the burials and things like this, but not within the burial itself. That could just be from robbing, because all of these tombs have been robbed. This is what it looks like from a half section. You can see sort of how chaotic the structure is from the middle, and you can see how carefully the burial is done. These are called in the local Beja language a keratahile, which means something like hard place in Beja. There were some other tomb types at Korafit. There's some crevice burials which use large rocks on the side of a hill to make a burial. These are common in Sudan and Fourth Cataract as well. And we have one example of this sort of dome structure, which is kind of important because these are usually dated to first millennium BCE, which is otherwise missing at this particular site. Next to the late antique Akeratahiles, we also have a small structure of tombs of a very different type. That's tombs numbers 70 to 75. And these are Neolithic tumuli, which were only discovered as such after investigation. They're very deep shafts, about 2 meters deep. And you can see this ring structure of where the stones were excavated and arranged in a ring around them. We excavated 2 of these, and this is Rebecca Whiting, Derek Wellesby, Kefaway Ramatuloa, and Hazaifa Abdelmagid excavating these particular structures. And very deep, one of them we found no human remains but pottery, and in the other one we found a lot of pottery. One of them we found no human remains and pottery, and one of them was the inverse. We did find a skeleton and only a tiny amount of sherds. So it's quite strange that we had one of these tumuli with no human remains, or what seems like no human remains. But they did have intact Neolithic pottery, which was fun to find, a lovely spouted vessel, and also a vessel with this tiny rim decoration, rim incisions. In one of these tombs, we also found this tiny sherd, which I thought was really exciting because it looks like a sherd of this sort of type of ware of a caliciform beaker, and the particular decoration style you see on this caliciform beaker, which would date these structures and this cemetery to the 5th millennium BCE, which is really cool. I don't know if we have any of these caliciform beakers in the Eastern Desert. They're very common on the Sudanese Nile, even common in the Western Desert. And now we can extend this sort of cultural horizon into the Eastern Desert. We did a ceramic sampling of much of the sites. When it comes to the pottery, most of it was imported wares, and most of it seems to date between the 4th century and maybe as late as 1000 CE in the case of the glaze wares. We have post-Meroitic and Christian wares. I'm still working on trying to date and find exact parallels of all of these types. We have some Aswan wares and some other Egyptian wares and pink clays. We have some late Roman amphorae, I think LRA 2 is this one, which is 6th, 7th century from memory, and some glaze wares. And we also have some wares I just can't identify, but I'm working on that at the moment. We also have a small amount of Eastern Desert ware, which is the ware we connect with the local nomadic culture. And importantly, we found this not only just in the cemetery, but we also found it in the camps near the gold mine itself, which brings up all sorts of interesting questions regarding the status of nomads at this site. Are the nomads miners? Are the nomads helping foreign miners like Romans and Nubians? Or is there some sort of cooperative enterprise? By this period, we don't really think that Romans could assert enough hegemony in the desert to begin and construct all this mining industry themselves. But we have to come up with some sort of new model, because we do have a lot of Roman material, we have a lot of Arab Islamic material, Nubian material, and late antique material. Most of the Nubian wares were found near the cemetery site, although some were found near the gold mine. The late Roman amphora and glaze wares were all found in the gold working area, so they are definitely connected to exchange regarding the gold mining. To sort of wrap up the archaeology of this particular site, here is just a basic schema of where we want to work in the geological profile. We have the Wadi bed and Wadi alluvium, which we almost never find any material on. I guess it's so disturbed, one would have to excavate within the alluvium to find any material because of flash flooding. It's only on the gravel terrace, the so-called hamada, like this area, where you actually find a lot of material. And because of deflation, we actually have paleolithic material to modern material all sitting on the desert surface, and including Neolithic and late antique structures sitting right next to each other on the desert surface. At some other sites, we have late antique keratohyles built on top of Neolithic burials, so I wouldn't discount the same thing happening at this site. We also have a Neolithic occupation on the high plateaus there. We only did a very short reconnoiter of the plateau, so there is some potential for material on the plateau of Jebel Rafit itself, but most of the material is on these hamadas. And the problem with these hamadas is they don't occur, or they're not very wide, in the middle of the Red Sea hills where the ravines are steep, which explain some of our archaeological and chronological profiles of why we don't find sort of second millennium, first millennium BCE archaeology in some parts of the Atbai, because unless we have a really intact hamada, it is very difficult to identify the archaeology. I've got a few more minutes, so I'll just try and wrap up the talk with the rock art we found at the site. I found the rock art by actually following the ancient tracks. We had one node and station of Neolithic rock art, as I mentioned, but we also have a large rock art boulder, AS 1911, which I found after leaving a track from the gold mine over these hills. And this is a large track, probably part of the Cusco Road. And this is the large station of rock art we found. It's one of the largest concentrations of rock art in the Atbai, I guess, smaller than Bir Nurayat, but the second one after that. And it's got a huge amount of material on it. It's got cattle, ostriches, camels, herdsmen, anthropomorphs, lots of different felines and quadrupeds that I can't identify. There's over 100 images on the eastern side, some images on the western side, and even some images on the top, which I had to do proper bouldering to get up to, which was unexpected. This is an orthomosaic of the rock art we found here, lots of cattle. There's at least 2 horizons here, and you can see them easily in the palimpsest of the rock art. You can see this older horizon, which is mainly cattle, sometimes ostriches as well. And then there's this newer horizon, a much more fresher patina, which also includes camels, which means we're of a late antique date. So when you put this all together, I would make 2 horizons here, something like a Neolithic to Middle Nubian horizon, which includes cattle. And I call this the cow period, after many other scholars that have studied rock art in Sudan. And then we have this late antique horizon. The problem we have here is trying to match this with the climate record. And we have cattle in the late antique horizon, which is sort of unexpected because it shouldn't be possible to keep cattle at this site in late antiquity. But generally, apart from that, we have camels, men holding javelins and swords, spears, and some wasm, these camel brands. And in the earlier horizon, we just have cattle, staffed man, and some ostriches. It's very difficult for me, I'm not a technical rock art expert, to finitely date these particular features. I'm sure someone like Dorian Van Hoel or Pavel Volkovsky can do a much better job. Just to wrap up this, I just want to say thank you to everyone that's joined me on these expeditions in the past. It really is quite difficult, and so I sort of feel apologetic to everyone that wants to join me to camp in the desert, sometimes for almost up to a month, and live out of 2 forward drives. And just to thank you to everyone that's joined our mission, particularly Vivian Davies, Azaifa Abdelmaged, Derek Wellesby, Pierre Moran, Mubarak Adams, Mohammed Saleh, Osman Dafala, Mahmoud Soliman Bashir, and of course a big thank you to NCAM and all my sponsors who sponsored this. Thank you very much.